Hello, everyone, and welcome. Just looking at my notes here, we'll see and let some people trickle in as we've just hit noon. I can hear the bells chiming on McGill's downtown lower campus outside at the ROAAr gates. So thank you everyone for joining us for Knitting in Code. My name is Jacquelyn Sundberg. I am a knitter, a reader, and a book lover, and I work here at the McGill Library with the ROAAr group, and that stands for Rare Books and Special Collections, the Osler Library of the History of Medicine, the Visual Arts Collection, and Archives and Records Management. So welcome everyone. You can let us know in the YouTube chat where you're tuning in from, and we do welcome engagement and comments throughout the event. I will say that we welcome everyone, and yes, do let us know where you're tuning in from. We'll be moderating the YouTube chat, and we do have a slight delay. We do expect a number of people to view today's event, and we're just going to slow down the chat a little bit so we can better able to respond to all of you. So chat and questions for our speaker welcome throughout the event. You can also send comments and questions by email to the address you see on screen there, roar.library@mcgill.ca. If you have trouble joining, or if you need technical support, if you have questions and comments on Kristen's talk, please do reach out either by email or in the Zoom chat, or sorry, the YouTube chat. A note on that, you do need to be logged into a YouTube account to comment. You don't need to be logged in to view, but the alternative to a YouTube account is you can absolutely send us questions by email. So welcome everyone. We will have a Q&A at the end of the event. So do post your questions by email or in the chat. I am tuning in, as I mentioned, from McGill's downtown campus, which is in Montreal, and it's situated on land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. ROAAR honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which I, for my part, am joining all of you today. So that's where I am, and actually where a few of us are tuning in from today. Kristen is up on the 4th floor in our ROAAR Books and Special Collections unit, and that's where Lyons is also joining us from. So a few of us are representing on the downtown campus today. On that note, here's a snapshot of what's coming up today. We're going to have opening comments from Nathalie Cooke, who's the Associate Dean of ROAAR. We're going to have some collection comments from Lyons, who's the head librarian at Rare Books and Special Collections, giving you a sneak peek into some of the knitting history content in our ROAAR collections. And then, of course, the main event with Kristen Howard, Knitting in Code. So thank you all for your curiosity and your interest in knitting. Kristen's also going to present a new knitting pattern incorporating both Morse Code and illusion knitting. Another way of hiding secret messages in stitches. It's really an interesting pattern, and I'm excited to hear from Kristen in a little bit. For now, I'm going to pass the microphone to Nathalie Cooke. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Nathalie, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jacquelyn. You know what, it's a real pleasure today to be able to introduce Kristen, who's part of our team researching codes and ciphers. And so this is one variety of being able to encode messages through knitting. It's also a pleasure to be introducing her today in particular because it's a special day. It's McGill 24. And if you look behind Kristen, you'll see there's a little sticker, and I have stickers behind mine because this is a special fundraising day. It's a 24-hour moment of fundraising where your gifts can actually be enhanced and leveraged by matching funding. And you know, this is true if you give to the library today, and it's true if you gave very generously when you signed up for this event, as 230 of you already have. So huge thanks for that. We have a little video now just to show you 200 reasons why you might want to give to the library. So this little video was made by a very talented student staff member, Elisa Nasova, and it highlights wonderful reasons to give to the library. And of course, we're secretly very proud of all of the things from ROAAr that show up in that video, and the fact it's organized around the principle of the alphabet, which is what allows us to organize our book, A Maze. Now, today's talk is celebration of some of the ways that ROAAr's collections inspires creative projects and research. The topic takes us back almost 80 years to a time when knitting, yes, knitting was an integral part of the war effort. Kristen Howard, who's a historian and a skilled knitter, she's going to illuminate that moment for us. In addition, and this is the really special part, she's created a new knitting pattern, exemplifying some of these coded and illusion knitting techniques. We'll give Kristen a proper introduction shortly, but for now, I just want to say a few thank yous. First of all, thank you to our very generous supporters, Ron Harvey and Doug Bagley, who allowed us to leverage their donation to obtain some government funds so that we have some money from SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, to support these events. And also thanks to all the people behind the scenes who you're not actually going to see, but you'll hear from. The team today is Julien Couture, Michelle McLeod, Labiba Faiza, and Jacquelyn, who works as the moderator and the wizard behind the machinery. I'm going to pass the microphone now to Chris Lyons, who's the head librarian of Rare Books and Special Collections. And he's going to give us just a few comments about things in the ROAAr collection that inspired Kristen's pattern and also the historical content that's related to her talk today. So I'm really looking forward to it. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Nathalie. I really appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. So for McGill 24, I'm wearing my McGill Proud button. I am proud to be associated with McGill. I don't know if McGill feels the same way, but I'll let my boss decide that. Anyway, I just wanted to introduce some things in our collection to you. And I have to be honest with you, my initial reaction to the request was a bit, I'm going to have to go back a bit here. I really knit my brow when I was asked to do this because, you know, we have great Voltaire collections, natural history collections, we have children's collections, history of medicine, wonderful things, but we don't really have a textile or a knitting or weaving collection per se. So, you know, it was really like trying to find a needle in a haystack to find this. And I warn you, the puns are going to be coming fast and furious. So I apologize for that and just darn me for doing that. Anyway, I did sort of get a sense of it. And I do have something, and I noticed some interesting patterns in our material. Okay. First of all, we have a children's collection. The children's collection by Sheila Bork was the main donor. It goes back hundreds of years. And what you're looking at here is an early 19th century example of a knitting book for children and ladies, as they say. And I put the toonie on it. It wasn't the loonie. It wasn't part of the original publication. And just to give you a sense of the size, it's a tiny thing, no illustrations. Giving you a sense of the evolution of children books publishing, you can see an early 20th century example of a knitting book for children with examples and everything, much more colorful. You can see a real advance in publishing. And then during the Second World War, talking about our topic, we have a form of publishing that was done to raise funds for charity, in this case, the Red Cross. And this is in 1939, beginning of the Second World War. And it has knitting material, the knitting ideas for men and women, particularly for things one would require when you were either out fighting or related activity because of the war. So again, an interesting, the home element of it. But remember, you know, weaving, knitting, textiles are an industry as well. And that's where we have a lot of material. The item on the left is from the early 17th century about, you know, the economics of growing, you know, sheep for wool in the English countryside. And on the right's an early 20th century journal. It was a publication on the textile industry in Canada, filled with information. Cross-country, big mills, everything. It's a huge industry, and you get a sense of it. Those are a couple of the pages from it. You can see the big woolen mill there on the right, and on the left, you see some of the ads that give you a sense of the scope of it. Then, no, it's so interesting. The same time is you've got this whole industrial side, you also have this folkloric side. So this is again from our children's collection, and this is looking at traditional Quebecois society done in the 1930s. And it includes amongst, sugaring off and things like that, spinning and weaving as well. And again, it gives you a sense of this as sort of a yesteryear sort of activity. What I also found interesting is at the same time, Quebec, this is a Quebec agricultural publication, promoting home weaving as a countryside skill to be developed by people. They're saying this is dying out. It's not only a good handicraft for people to do, but it's also a way to make some extra money in the countryside. So it ties into the Depression. It overtly references back to the land. So there's interesting historical context for this. And as you can see, illustrations are, this is the equipment, this is how you use it, and then you get some patterns as well. So that's one publication from 1930s. And then we have, and this really I found fascinating, is McGill ran an extension program, Macdonald College, mostly for people in the countryside. That was the whole raison d'etre of Macdonald College, if you know its history. So this is handicrafts, teaching people. This is adult education, part-time. And one of the handicrafts that's being promoted and was being taught was knitting and weaving. And as you see on the right, the rationale for that was doing things like improving society, having handicrafts together, and also teaching young people skills so that they can develop the proper skills and so vocational education. So wonderful, wonderful collection of material that I found by poking around. It was really exciting. But enough about me. I do want to say this is all accessible for you. Anyone could come and use this material. Just contact us and help us, and we'll do it. We got all neat stuff all over the place. But I'm going to pass the mic over to Kristen now, who's going to spin a few yarns for you. And just to, a little bit about herself, and promise that's the last punt. She's a historian, knitter, and a Master of Information Studies here at McGill, student at McGill. She completed a PhD in a much warmer climate in history from the Division of Late Medieval and Reformation Studies at the University of Arizona in 2020. And figured what better way to cool off than to come north to Montreal. And she currently studies library and archival sciences and is interested in animating special collections through public history and creative projects. So with no further ado, I turn the mic over to you, Kristen, or I pass the needle.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. Thanks for sharing those wonderful items from the collection. I have a few more that I'm going to share during my presentation. Thank you also to Nathalie and Jacquelyn, and to ROAAR and the McGill Library for helping me make this event happen. I'm absolutely delighted at the amount of interest that people have shown in this event. And I just can't wait to share some tales about knitting espionage with you. There won't be nearly as many puns as Chris gave, and also to share my knitting pattern. So for us to get started here, I am going to first tell you a little story about knitting espionage. In October 1918, the British magazine Pearson's published an article titled "German War Ciphers." The article describes how the British government began the Great War, believing they already knew all of the German government's methods of secret communication. But over time, they realized that the Germans had actually developed some new messages in plain sight, in letters, in pictures, even in descriptions of chess games that people were sending to each other in the mail. But as the article stated, in situations where a letter couldn't be passed between German agents, it's still possible for a German agent to communicate with his secret service. For example, a knit sweater was sent into Germany from one of the belligerent countries to a prisoner of war, in which a summary of naval preparedness was hidden by means of a knot cipher. According to this relatively simple, yet, according to the article, absolutely ingenious cipher, the yarn used to knit a sweater is full of innumerable knots, each of which corresponds to letters of the alphabet. And that is our first example of knitting espionage. Now, those of us who are knitters know that it's pretty unlikely that such a cipher would work really well. First of all, I'm not sure about you, but I wouldn't be interested in knitting a sweater with yarn full of knots. I know that the knots would always come to the front and it'd be quite clear that it didn't fit into the pattern. And second of all, we all know that it takes more than one skein of yarn to knit a sweater, so it's not clear exactly how the cipher would work. But regardless of whether or not this would actually work, the story permeated the British imagination. And no wonder, knitting is an excellent method of hiding secret messages due to its binary nature of knit and purl stitches. And a knitting pattern is impossible for the uninitiated to decipher, which might be why apparently both the US and the UK made it illegal to send knitting patterns through the mail during World War II. I do say apparently there because I've been trying to check this, and it will take some archival research to determine whether or not that's true. Now, today I'm going to talk about more methods of knitting espionage and knitting in code using 3 case studies of wartime knitting: the American Revolutionary War, the French Revolution, and then turning back to the World Wars. So we'll start with our first case study of the American Revolutionary War. Now, to set the stage, I want to talk about the cultural importance of knitting during wartime. Today, we often think of knitting as primarily a hobby or even a relaxation activity, but for much of history, knitting was much more than a hobby. It was a way of life. Knitting became a patriotic duty of women in the American Revolutionary War and in other wars as well, as we'll see, although it's often been overlooked in scholarship. We do know that knitting was certainly a key part of domestic life, as we can glean from colonial newspapers like these 2 advertisements that I'm showing you here. We often see advertised the sale of knitting needles and knitting pins, often made of iron, as well as knitting thread, knitting twine, and knitting cotton. And I looked to see if I could find any advertisements for patterns. And the only thing that I could find is this black stocking pattern that I have highlighted on the left. And I'm not sure if that's a knitting pattern or a sewing pattern, but I think it's more likely that we're knitting stockings instead of sewing them. But I'm not quite sure about that. I'll see if I can find something in future research. Now, other advertisements for indentured servants also demonstrate the importance of knitting. This 1775 advertisement notes that women Irish immigrants knew sewing, knitting, and spinning. I have that highlighted here for you. So you can see how important it is to be a knitter, that it's something that might help someone pick up your contract. Now, perhaps the most famous of all colonial knitters was Martha Washington, the wife of General and later President George Washington. And we see a portrait here of Martha and George Washington from the 19th century, and I have a detail of her hands where you can see that she is in fact knitting. She was known to knit stockings for soldiers in the Continental Army, and she even sold hand-knit stockings on at least one occasion, which she may have produced herself, and they may have been produced by one of the enslaved people who lived at the Mount Vernon plantation who did knit for the Washingtons. So in this portrait, we can see Martha holding double-pointed needles, and it looks to me like she's probably knitting a sock, but I think we can all agree that this is a pretty unlikely way to knit. I, for one, have never knit with my hands draped over someone else's shoulders. So I think that this isn't a portrait that makes sense while knitting, but instead it highlights how important knitting is to the figure of Martha Washington, as well as to constructions of womanhood during the colonial period. Now, although Martha Washington may have been and the first of many first lady knitters, she isn't the knitting spy I'd like to highlight for this case study. Rather, I want to talk about a woman named Molly Rinker, who was also called Mom Rinker. And we don't have a portrait for her, but I do have this 19th century map, and it'll become clear in a moment why this map is interesting or important. So according to 20th century historian John Backless, Molly Rinker's family owned the Buck Tavern in Germantown, Pennsylvania, the location of a key revolutionary battle that occurred on October 4th, 1777. Molly was well known as a spinner of flax, and she bleached the flax that she spun by laying it on a cliff above the Wissahickon Valley. During the Battle of Germantown, Molly would take to sitting on the cliff and knitting. Because knitting was such a peaceful domestic task that couldn't hide anything suspicious and that only women did, the British didn't find her activities suspicious. And this leads us to the first way in which knitting has often been used as in espionage, as a cover to distract the enemy or otherwise dispose the enemy, usually men in power, to ignore a woman, regardless of her age, due to the banality and femininity of her task. So Molly Rinker paid attention to the British troops who frequented her family's tavern and listened to what they were talking about, especially concerning troop movements. And anything interesting or perhaps useful that she heard, she would write down on little slips of paper. She would then take the slips of paper and wrap them around a small rock, and then take her yarn and wrap the yarn around the rock, creating a ball of yarn with a hidden message inside. She would then go up to the cliff for her knitting, and she would occasionally and apparently accidentally drop a ball of yarn, which would roll down the hill to where revolutionary troops operating under General George Washington would then retrieve the information, gaining critical insights to the movement of enemy troops. And today, you can visit what's called Mom Rinker's Rock inside Fairmount Park, which is in this 19th century map here, which is the largest park in the city of Philadelphia. So if you are on a vacation or you live in Philadelphia and you're interested in seeing a place where we know knitting espionage occurred, you can go to the park today. Now, whereas Molly Rinker is a historical example of a knitting spy, there are also literary examples of wartime knitters. And les tricoteuses of the French Revolution are perhaps the most famous of all knitters, historical or literary. According to lore, as well as French history, les tricoteuses, which simply translates to knitting women, were women who sat next to the guillotine and happily knit away while watching beheadings. And here we can see a contemporary painting from the 1790s of les tricoteuses, who are on the left-hand side here. These three women, two of whom are holding and actually doing the knitting, and the third one has her knitting in the pocket of her skirt. During the Reign of Terror from June 1793 to July 1794, almost 17,000 people were beheaded, including the French King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. Now, you may be familiar with the fictional character of Madame Thérèse Defarge, the infamous tricoteuse from Charles Dickens' 1859 novel, A Tale of Two Cities. And here is an image of Madame Defarge from A Tale of Two Cities. And she is seated at the bar, and she has her knitting kind of piled in front of her. It's not a very clear rendering of what she's knitting. It looks like there's one knitting needle sticking out instead of two, but perhaps what she's holding up to her face is her second needle. Now, the story goes that Madame Defarge employed different stitches in order to encode the names of those being executed within her knitting, and other characters within the story refer to this as the knitted register of Madame Defarge. Today, historians and literary scholars and cultural commentators seem divided as to whether les tricoteuses like Madame Defarge and her potential historical contemporaries actually existed. It does seem that Dickens based the character on the work of a British historian who published an in-depth history of the French Revolution about 10 years before A Tale of Two Cities was published. And this history included les tricoteuses and referred to them as patriot knitters. So much like women in the American Revolution were called patriotic knitters, so were these women who were knitting during the French Revolution. Many that les tricoteuses never existed. Now, as someone who myself has brought my knitting to every kind of imaginable cultural event, including sports games and the movie theater, I would be surprised if no woman brought their knitting along with them to the executions, because they were, after all, public spectacles. But I do find the idea that someone improvised a code to knit a bit sensational, especially after developing a code for knitting myself. I think that most likely what the women were actually knitting is, again, socks. And if we look at the detail of the painting and we look at what the women are actually holding, it does look again like they're knitting socks on double pointed needles, and they don't appear to have a pattern that would indicate that names are being knit into the socks. And if these women weren't knitting socks, there's a second item that it's likely that they were knitting. And those are called liberty caps, which we can see from, this is again a detail from that same painting I showed before. This was the right-hand side. And what we see this man doing here is throwing off his hat and wig and donning instead a red liberty cap. So the red liberty caps, known in French as le bonnet rouge or le bonnet de la liberté, became a symbol of the French Revolution beginning in 1790. These hats were based on the ancient Phrygian cap and are a brimless felt conical cap typically worn with the point tipping toward the front. And Marianne, the symbolic personification of France, is often depicted wearing a red Phrygian cap, as we can see here in one of the most famous paintings of Marianne leading the French people to victory. And I've given a detail to show you that it is in fact not her hair. It's a similar color to her hair, but she is wearing a red liberty cap. Many members of the Parisian working class donned the liberty cap during the French Revolution, and another part of the lore of the tricoteuses is that they knit liberty caps as they watched executions. Now, again, I'm going to draw on the knowledge that us who are knitters or other crafters have, which is that you can't simply knit a felt item. Felting requires a bit more processing than that. So we know that they couldn't have, or they likely didn't have buckets of water that they were felting inside while they were watching executions. But it's not unlikely that they were knitting hats that they would then felt later on. And it seems a bit more likely to me than Madame Defarge's encoded knitting. Now, some of you may already be thinking about a contemporary example of hats knitted for a political cause. The bonnets de la liberté are perhaps an earlier form of what we today call craftivism. And many people have noted the similarities between the red bonnet of the French Revolution, which is still sometimes donned by women protesting in France today, and the pink pussy hat created for the 2017 Women's March on Washington. And here's an example of one of these hats that today is in the Smithsonian. Now, in my opinion, these kinds of objects are another way in which we can knit and code. They're a way for coded information to be transmitted through knitting or other crafting. In these cases, the knit objects themselves become political and come to mean much more than wearing a simple red or pink hat. Creating such objects is a method of knitting and code. All right, now for our third and final case study, the World Wars. Most popular and scholarly writing on knitting during the World Wars, and especially during World War II, is focused on what's typically called relief knitting. And here are a couple of knitting propaganda posters. I absolutely love these posters. One is from World War I, the one on the left, and the one on the right is, of course, from World War II. Men, women, and children on the home front in Canada, the United States, and the UK were all called to knit for our boys during World Wars. Children were taught to knit in school, prisoners were taught to knit in jail, and as this next photo shows, knitting became a common pastime during lunch hours, and there are many more photos of people knitting at bus stops, in the park, in public, while waiting at restaurants, all over. And if you're wondering what this photo is, there is some text, but it's probably a little bit small for you. This is the Universal Motion Picture Company in New York, and it became a pastime at this business for the women secretarial employees to teach the remaining male employees how to knit during lunchtime, and they would knit, they would do relief knitting during every lunchtime. That's what this photo is of. Now, while women were called to serve the war effort by knitting, and here is a sample of a pattern of knitting, and we can see women in war. This is one of the ways in which women were called to serve the war effort. There were some women, like Molly Rinker from the American Revolutionary War, used as a cover for espionage. It's been widely reported that during World War I, the British Secret Intelligence Service, known as MI6, recruited women who lived near railway yards to spy on Germans invading their countries as part of both the Belgian and French resistance movements. One fairly famous story is that of a French woman named Madame Levong, who was forced to quarter a German rail marshal in her home because she lived near a train station. Now, what she would do is she sat on her second floor and she would watch the troop movements while knitting, because of course no one can do anything nefarious while knitting. And she would tap signals with her heels, perhaps in Morse code, but we're not sure, to her children who were sitting downstairs working on their homework. And this allowed the family to pass crucial information right under the quartered marshal's nose to the Alice Network, a World War I spy ring that operated in German-occupied France and Belgium. So that's an example from World War I. Knitting espionage also occurred during World War II, and the most well-known knitting spy is a woman named Phyllis Pippa Latour Doyle, who today is almost 101 years old. Her birthday is next month, and she currently lives in New Zealand. There are many photos of Pippa available online, and because her 100th birthday was last year, there are lots of articles, so I highly encourage you to look her up. I'm going to show you this recruitment poster for the WAAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, because that's what Pippa first volunteered for. After she volunteered for the WAAF, she was recruited into the SOE, or Special Operations Executive, which was a secret special forces British organization, that operated during World War II and was nicknamed Churchill's Secret Army. And she was recruited into the SOE because she was fluent in French. After her training, Pippa parachuted into occupied Normandy in 1944 and conducted espionage for the Allied forces using knitting as a cover. In a 2009 interview with the New Zealand Army News, she described her use of knitting to cover and hide her espionage. And here's the quote for you here. She describes how her codes were kept on a piece of silk, and what she would do when she was done with her codes is prick them with a pin so she knew they were used up, and she would hide this by wrapping the silk around a knitting needle. And there were also times where she would tie her hair up with her codes to keep the German soldiers who she was speaking with from knowing that she was conducting espionage. In total, Pippa spent 4 months in France as a spy, and she sent 135 messages. She received the Legion of Honor from France in 2014 for her role in the French Liberation. Now, surely there were other spies who also thought to use knitting as a cover. It's clearly fairly effective. Why don't we know more about them? I think that many knitting spies in many wars have probably been lost to history because essentially these women were good at their jobs. They kept their spying activities secret. And according to reporting, Pippa, our famous World War II spy, she only told her children about her past as a spy in 2000, over 50 years after the end of the war. So she really kept this a secret. So it's not surprising that there would be more women spies who used knitting as a cover who just never told anyone their story. Okay, now that I've discussed our 3 case studies of wartime knitting, I'd like to turn to my knitting pattern that I developed for this project, which I've called the Secret Message Pillow Cover. And I've made 2 samples of this, and you can see my picture here. So in addition to drawing inspiration from all these case studies that I just told you about, I also turned to a few items in McGill's Rare Books and Special Collections library that I'd like to share and kind of tell you how they inspired me. So first, why did I choose a pillow cover? Probably not the most effective way to conduct espionage. I wanted to design something that had a lot of flexibility, and I settled on a pillow cover after looking through the item that Chris already showed you, the World War II Red Cross book that's in McGill's collection. So Chris showed you the really nice dust cover, which is very beautiful, and this is a picture of the cover without the dust cover. So this book has a short chapter titled Our Knitting Forces by Mary Thomas, who is the former editor of the magazine The Needlewoman, which was a quarterly magazine published in the UK. Now, in this work, Thomas describes wartime knitting, stating that, quote, mothers knit items in wartime, including mittens and socks, and that they always have and always will do so, and they are always greatly appreciated. And that's the end of the quote. And she does really mean always. You can see in this small image on the screen right here. I'll try circling it. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see that very well. We see what seems to be me being a knight going off to the Crusades with a woman who has knitted his tabernacle with a cross. So she's really drawing back quite far there when she says that. She also offers suggestions on how to knit during a blackout. So during the war, if you weren't allowed to have your lights on, how you could keep that from hampering your knitting. And she describes ways to knit garments without following long written directions, which I think indicates that not everyone who wanted to conduct relief knitting either knew how to read a pattern or wanted to knit with a pattern. And this despite the fact that there were tons of free knitting patterns made available during both World Wars. But now what actually inspired me from this for my pattern is, along with some of the more typical wartime patterns we see, including jumpers, sleeveless jumpers, and stockings, she provides a pattern for a modern knitted cushion, which I'm showing you here with a couple of highlights. This pattern is knit side to side, and it features all over moss stitch pattern, as well as a 3-needle bind off, which I find pretty interesting. She describes how to do a 3-needle bind off here without saying that you need a 3rd needle, but she doesn't call it that. So we must have named that kind of a bind off since then. So I used this as an inspiration for my pattern. I used moss stitch as one of my pattern options, as well as a 3-needle bind off for one of my seaming options. And you can see my moss stitch back to one of my samples right here. So now that I knew that I wanted to create a pillow cover, I needed to decide how to incorporate code into the pattern. And I settled on 2 methods, Morse code using knit and purl stitches, and illusion knitting. So after deciding on Morse code, I had to develop a chart that could be used in the pattern, or really in anything else if you'd like to use this idea. And you can see here my Morse code chart, which uses purl stitches set against a regular stockinette background. But then I had to decide, after making the chart, what message I wanted to encode in the pillow. And so I again turned to the Rare Books library here at McGill, and I found an amazing little book of poetry that was published during the First World War by a Canadian woman under the pen name Catherine Hale. The title poem, Grey Knitting, is what I decided to use as my inspiration here. And you can see this absolutely lovely cover, and I'll just describe it to you a little bit. So in the bottom right-hand corner, we see a woman sitting and knitting, and there's a child at her feet. And from her hands, we see a gilt yarn going up through the title and up to the upper left, where we see a soldier who looks to me to be reading a letter, and that he has stockings hung over the fire, likely to dry. So we see that in this image that we're connecting people knitting on the home front with soldiers who are on the front lines. And I think that that's a really, really lovely image. And we can see that she dedicated this book of poetry to the women who knit. So I decided to take the poem, which you can see here, and you can also find it online if you just look up Grey Knitting, Catherine Hale. So I took the first stanza of the poem and I used my charts to encode it in Morse code. And that is what is on my gray pillow sample. So if you were well versed in reading Morse code, you could read a little bit of poetry if you come to my house to see this pillow. So I went from the poem, this is the chart, and I made the chart for the first stanza of Grey Knitting available in the pattern. So if you'd like to put this poem onto your own version of this, you are absolutely welcome to do that. Now for the second sample, I wanted to incorporate a second way in which to hide a code, and I decided to use illusion knitting, which is also called shadow knitting. And this is a method of working 2 colors of yarn in stripes in a pre-planned texture, which allows an image or a message to be viewed only when seen at a certain angle. And so here is my sample right here using red and black. So the first illusion knitting patterns that I can find in English were published in 2002, and the technique appears to have originated in Japan and was brought from Japan before becoming more kind of universal. And I would love to learn a bit more about the origins of illusion knitting in Japan. So for the illusion knitting part of my pattern, I wanted to make a simple design that could reflect the spirit of wartime knitting, and that's why I chose the symbol of the Red Cross, as you can see here from the knitting relief poster. Because the Red Cross was so important in creating and coordinating wartime knitting efforts. So if you're interested in other ways of knitting in code, available.
Sorry, Kristen, you froze for a moment there. Do you want to?
Yeah, sorry about
other
that.
ways of knitting in code?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So if you're interested in other ways of knitting in code, Isabel Kramer, who's a famous knitting designer, has a sweater and a cardigan pattern called the Purl Code and the Purl Code cardigan that you can find online. And if you're interested in illusion knitting, I highly recommend the patterns of Steve Plummer. They are absolutely works of art. So if you're interested in making a wall hanging, for example, please look at his patterns. And Vivian Hawksbrough is also has some wonderful illusion knitting patterns that you can look to if you want something a little bit more complicated than my simple cross. If you're interested in reading more about knitting espionage, the role that knitting has played in history, I recommend these two books, Loretta Napoleoni's The Power of Knitting and Esther Rudder's This Golden Fleece. They talk about some of the case studies that I talk about, as well as a large number of other ways in which knitting has been impactful in history. And that's it. I'll stop sharing screen and show you my samples a little bit larger. Please feel free to email me, and you can find me on Twitter, Ravelry, or Instagram. Please do follow McGill's Rare Books Library on Instagram and Twitter. They share some really wonderful things. Thank you again so much to the library for allowing me to do this. It's been really wonderful. And I'll just go back to my full screen so I can show you the samples just a little bit bigger. So this is the gray sample. This is gray knitting. So you can see this is, as I said, the first stanza of the poem with moss stitch on the back, following the pattern that I found. And I prefer having a button band closure so that I can take it off whenever I'd like. And this is the illusion sample. And you can see the symbol coming out there. It's a little bit harder to see on a slightly rounded surface. So I also brought my first sample so I can show you quite well exactly how the pattern works. And something that's fun about this is that the cross works both directions. So you can do it sideways as well. So your pillow on your couch, wherever you keep it, can show it no matter what direction you're viewing it from. Okay, that's everything for me.
Thanks so much, Kristen. There's a applause from some of the people in our Zoom meeting and a large number of thank yous from our YouTube viewers. I will invite everyone, if you have questions about any of the materials that Kristen spoke about, some of those revolutionary knitters, or of course the French revolutionary knitters as well, please do put them in the YouTube chat and I will voice them on your behalf for Kristen. And Kristen, you did predict that someone would ask about your sweater pattern, and they did. So if you want to tell us what sweater you're wearing, we can go right ahead.
Yes, this is Hetty by Andy Satterlund. Andy has a large number of patterns, cardigan patterns that I think are quite lovely. And it's in a budget yarn. It's in a Knit Picks Wool of the Andes tweed in Sequoia Heather, which I bought on discount a number of years ago.
You're a true enthusiastic knitter. You're one of the community. You cite all of your sources like a good scholar and a good knitter. So thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question. One of the case studies really did catch my interest. And I'm going to pull up my one other window here, but the fervor that really took over knitters during the First World War and the Second World War. You touched on it. You showed one of those photos of people knitting at lunch hour, and your pillow cover did make me think also of the craze for knitting bags, actually, that came with that craze, especially during the First World War, of knitters taking their knitting everywhere on the metro, and they would have a Red Cross branded knit on the metro or on the subway, or wherever they were, so they could carry it with them. We're getting lots and lots of thank yous in the chat, and also requests for contact information and pattern links. We will absolutely include that in a follow-up message as well. But my question was that fervor, that craze, and kind of, do you see that revival? There was this interest of knitting for a cause that really gathered momentum. And I guess, I mean, what were your impressions as you learned more about this? And you touched on it briefly, but what do you think about that knitting craze? Has it come back in a different way? Do you see a resurrection of that?
Yeah, I think that the kind of knitting craze is just so interesting and so in some ways so wonderful, because we do see people, we see in photographs now, people knitting absolutely everywhere. It was really seen as a way that everyone could contribute to the war effort. When we were advertising this event, someone sent us some information on Twitter saying that they have, that one of their keepsakes of their late mother-in-law is like a piece of paper saying that she knit one sock for a soldier, which is just so wonderful, because I think what that indicates is that she must not have been a knitter if she knit one sock and not two. You know, second sock syndrome is real, right? Mm-hmm. But even people who didn't know how to knit really wanted to contribute. And I think that a lot of times when there are challenging circumstances that we face, we see people wanting to contribute in any way that they can. During recent refugee crises, we have seen knitters making blankets. For the Women's March.
The example that came to my mind was much more trivial in a way, but it made headlines all the same. I remember there was a crisis where knitters jumped to the needles for penguins, knitting penguin sweaters, and there was an overflow, much like in the Second World War when relief knitting really took off. There was a surplus of sweaters and not enough socks. So many sweaters badly knit and so many socks lacking a pair. But that enthusiasm is definitely there.
Yeah, and we saw it as well recently when the pandemic first started, and we all kind of needed some things to do, and then we had the Australian wildfires happening kind of at the same time. And one thing we were told to do is that we could knit or sew pouches for baby kangaroos, and that would help.
Right.
And they received so many, they had to ask people to stop sending them because they didn't have any place to keep them. So we do have all these examples where we get the fervor when we feel that our talents, our skills could be useful. And I think that that's really wonderful.
I think there's one question or a few follow-up questions about Phyllis Pippa Latour. I didn't catch her full name. Can you tell us again her full name and a little bit more about her? She really caught everyone's interest.
Yes, Phyllis Pippa Latour Doyle. She was born, if I remember correctly, in South Africa. She volunteered for World War II in England, was sent to France to conduct her spy work, and she today lives in New Zealand. And her 101st birthday will be next month. And there are quite a few articles written about her in the last year because of her 100th birthday. So again, Phyllis Pippa Latour Doyle, and she's sometimes just called Phyllis Latour or Phyllis Doyle. And she worked under at least 3 different code names. I remember Genevieve was one of them. I can't quite recall the other 2, but I think that she is an absolutely fascinating person. And one of the stories about her is that she was at one point caught, I suppose. She was suspected by the Germans of conducting spying, and they looked and they made her turn out her pockets, turn out her knitting bag. She had to, show them everything, and they even made her take out her hair tie and shake out her hair. And of course, her hair tie is where she had her codes hidden. So she was that close to being caught. I think it must have been terrifying to have a German agent, suspecting that you were keeping something secret in your hair, and in fact you were. But yes, she conducted spying for 4 months.
So yeah, it's such a fascinating case, and amazing that she's still alive and has such a legacy. One follow-up question about the World War II knitters as well from the crowd is, do you know anything, or whether it's true, that English knitters viewed continental style knitters as possible spies in that era?
I've never read that, but I would imagine that it's entirely possible because of the different methods, and because there was suspicions that information could be passed between patterns. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that's true. I haven't come across that yet.
One follow-up question. I don't know if you know the answer, but do you know if there's any books written about Pippa Latour?
There are no books written about her, a number of articles, but no books yet.
A follow-up question for you in particular, is this the topic of your dissertation?
No, this is not. This is my
and a follow-up on the same topic. Will you publish it as a talk? Or
It's
as
on a poor relief and social welfare in 16th century Europe. This is kind of a side interest of mine.
A dovetailing of your knitting interest and your historical interest, of course. Yes. One question particularly about the Morse code pattern. We did have a number of suggestions and comments in the chat about that pattern and the other ones that you suggested. And I will say we will send out links to the recommendations that Kristen gave in a follow-up message, as well as a link to the download on Ravelry of Kristen's pattern, which if you're not a Ravelry member, you can also have access to the pattern. We'll make it available other ways as well. But the question was regarding line breaks in Morse code. How did you work that into your pattern?
Yes, so that was something that's a little bit complicated. And so in the pattern, I give a suggestion of, or I give directions on how many blank spaces, which in the pattern are represented as knit stitches, to have between letters inside of a word, between words, and then between sentences. And what I did for my pattern, because there's a limited amount of space between these, is I did not use the way that the poem is written. I didn't adhere to that style. Instead, I just have the words spaced out. So if you were to translate from this, you would just get one long line. And you can see that each line starts nicely over here, all lined up, but on this side, it's ending in all different spaces. So I just did the best that I could to fit the letters and the words together. So it doesn't adhere to the spirit of how the poem looks, which is the challenge of choosing poetry as kind of my choice to put onto the pillow. But that's the best way that I thought that I could make use of as much space of the pillow as possible. But
I'm thinking about the telegraph. How did they handle line breaks? I guess you could have encoded the word stop.
Yes.
For a line break.
And I included the Morse code for, I believe, if I remember correctly, I included the Morse code for a period, a comma, an ampersand, an exclamation mark, and maybe a hyphen, as well as for numbers. There are more symbols in Morse code. And so one of them is for a stop, and then there are some other options as well. And so if you would like to use some of those, you can go and look up, the full Morse code instead of just kind of the selection that I thought would be most useful for knitters. I included numbers in case somebody wanted to encode like a date, for example. I thought something that could be fun to encode could be, the date of a birth or of a special event or of a marriage, something like that. I thought that could be the kind of thing that knitters might want to encode on their pillows.
There's of course also online translators into which you can plug your content and it will generate the code itself. There's some interesting comments in the chat actually about alternative ways of representing coded communication or in a different language. One comment I made as you were giving your presentation is that your pillow is actually accessible to the visually impaired because you could feel and decipher the code that way. And someone has commented in the chat actually that they have knit braille patterns and created braille textiles and that sort of thing, but this might actually be easier to decipher because the purls are more distinct. So it's an interesting comment. Another comment in the chat is that you could possibly create a coded pattern using beaded work and using the beads strung along your yarn to create that encoded pattern, which is a great suggestion.
That's a fantastic idea. Knitting with beads is one thing I've never done. That's kind of on my knitting bucket list that I've never tried. I
agree. I've never done it. The work of threading all your beads was prohibitive to me up till now.
There are other patterns. I didn't mention this on Ravelry using Morse code, some of which use colors instead of. So if you wanted to knit color work, you could even use the same chart using a different color instead of doing purl stitches. There are some methods where you that are a bit more similar to the temperature blankets and those kinds of things that are fairly popular now, where you knit the entire row. And so one entire row would be, a short dash, and then 3 rows would be a long dash. So there are that you could look at or experiment with if you were interested in having something even more secret or that works more for your personal style or your personal knitting preferences.
Yes, and I'm wearing color work. I would be interested in developing a code using the colors and the repeated patterns or the lack of repeated patterns. So it's one of the interesting things. Like I know Gansey sweaters have this very intense, they're usually single color, but the pattern could be used to communicate something. So you might want to dig all of the old mid-century sweaters out of your attics and cedar chests and go looking for coded messages in old knit pieces from the era.
Ganseys is a wonderful thing to bring up, Jacquelyn. That's actually, we could consider that another way of knitting in code, because traditionally families would have their own particular Gansey pattern, much like people might have their own plaids, for example, or even coats of arms. It's another way in which an individual or a person could represent particular things about their family, about where they're from in knitting. So Ganseys is a wonderful example of another method, perhaps a non-wartime method of having a particular kind of code or message inside of knitting. I believe what I've read is that the reason that Ganseys, that you would have your own particular information on Ganseys is they were made for fishermen, and so if a sweater was recovered and not a person, then you'd be able to tell who it belonged to because of the patterning on the Gansey itself.
There's some great ideas in here coming in the chat as well. So Ganseys is a great one and I love them. Someone also asked about my pattern. I'm wearing Balmaha by Kate Davies in her yarn as well. So it's a lovely fabric to work with. Another one that came in is that you could use dye, gauged dye to create a coded pattern as well in there. And there's some advice on beading for you and I if we need inspiration.
Wonderful.
It's not as hard as we think. So thank you.
Dyeing is another method of kind of secret knitting that I found. I think it's much the idea of the kind of the knot cipher that I started the presentation with.
And there's actually a question on that in particular, knitting with knots. And you said you've not tried it, and if you know anything further, can elaborate on it at all. There's a question in there. We're all curious.
About the cipher in particular.
Well, the knitting with knots, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit complicated. I was going to have a slide where I included the kind of image of the cipher, but it's not, in my opinion, particularly informative. The story of the knot cipher is that the solution was on a door. So you take an entire door and you put the letters of the alphabet spaced particularly on this door, and you take the yarn with the knots, and when you put it across the door, then the knots line up for the letters and you can read what it says. That doesn't seem particularly ingenious to me as it says. I think,
it seems very secure as a form of encryption, and that you can only ever decrypt it by having that door. So it's very, very secure as a form of analog coded communication.
Yes, part of my concern with why this might not work out very well is the person who makes the knots in the yarn, which would be very challenging, would need to have the exact same dimensions of a door as the person they're sending it to. And that seems to me like you would need to send some coded information to begin with. So
yes, and that's true of many forms of physical or analog ciphers. That's true. You have to have the same physical medium to be able to decrypt it. We learned a bit more about this because this is the third in a series of 3 events on codes and ciphers and coded communication. We heard from an artist, Amy So Wu, on different forms of steganography, the practice of hiding messages in plain sight. So in some ways, your pillow is a form of steganography. You can put it on your couch and no one will know unless they start reading the Morse code. So we're running out of time here. I'm going to share my screen once more just to say a few thank yous. And I will say thank you from everyone in the YouTube crowd to Kristen for a fascinating talk and for illuminating so many interesting case studies that explores history as well as providing a crafty way to explore them. So thank yous from the YouTube crowd. I am going to share my screen just to show a couple final things as yes, this one. This is our next event on March 23rd. This is another one in our series about serious play. And this is an exhibition that's currently live here at the library. If you're Montreal local, it is on display in the library. And you can come and tune in virtually to hear us talk about it on March 23rd. And lastly, an enormous thank you to all of you who donated as part of McGill 24. Thank you to Kristen for doing this event on this day and letting us be part of the enthusiasm for supporting the research and collections here at McGill. So thank you for putting in the interesting research work and illuminating this topic for all of us. An enormous round of applause from us on Zoom and from the YouTube stream. There's a healthy discussion of Gansey and Guernsey sweaters in there. Apparently it is a myth, unfortunately. Yes, Roxanne Richardson has myth busted that one.
I haven't researched it, I've only heard it, so.
Yes, we're passing on the myth, but we've been fact checked in the YouTube chat. So thank you, everyone. And we will sign off there. Thank you so much for tuning in. You'll, as I promised, receive a follow-up email with a lot of interesting reading material. So bye for now. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks for sharing your lunch and your knitting and your tolerance for knitting puns with us today.